everyone, welcome. I'm Paula Sylvie. I'm a member of the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of the Catskills, which is a mouthful, so UU Catskills. And we're really pleased that we could make this space available. It should be a very interesting discussion today. Welcome also to those that are watching on Zoom. For those of you who are here in person, the restrooms are in the hallway and to your left, and there's also a water fountain there. And again, I just want to say welcome and introduce you maybe to a new term. I'm self-described Junitarian, which is a Jewish Unitarian Universalist. So, welcome.
All right, well, welcome to both the people in the live audience and to the people on Zoom. And if I have it correctly, people I'm sure will be joining us on Zoom over time, because it's always hard to be on time for your Zoom calls. But in any case, I'm Felice Gelman, and I'm part of the Middle East Crisis Response and Jewish Voice for Peace. And Ron?
Yes, I'm Ron David Gold. I'm president of...
It's good. It's all right.
Right?
It's okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. I'm president of the Jewish Federation of Ulster County. And I want to thank everybody who took the trouble to be here today. That's wonderful. And those of you on Zoom, this is a...
Be glad.
Go louder. All right, I could do that. This is a very exciting event today. Something that we've been looking forward to for a long time, which is a rational exchange of ideas on a very complicated topic. And we have two fabulous speakers today, two very qualified speakers who have dealt with this issue for most of their lives. And obviously it's something that has challenged wise people and people of both sides for a very long time. And to be able to meet at something like this and have a rational conversation is something that I've been looking forward to for a very long time. I hope it's the first of many that we do. And thanks again, everybody, for being here.
So before we will introduce our discussants, but before we get to that, I just want everybody in the audience to know that we will be taking questions at the end. And you all have index cards. If you have a question, just write it down and hold your hand up, and it will be collected. And Ron and I will decide on some questions. If there are a lot of questions, we're not going to have time for them all, so please don't feel offended. We'll also, for the people who are on Zoom, if you have a question, please put it in the chat to the host, and it will come to us, and we'll include that in our thinking about what questions we have time to answer.
A lot to say about David. He's the executive director of the Jewish Federation of Ulster County. He is a co-founder of the National Holocaust Awareness Initiative. That's a national not-for-profit established for Holocaust awareness among millennial, Gen X, and Gen Z population in the United States. He led the volunteer advisory board for Zaka Search and Rescue, an Israeli-founded United Nations sanctioned mass disaster response agency, conducting humanitarian rescue missions across the globe. He's been the national executive director of the Zionist Organization of America, the oldest pro-Israel organization in America. Earlier, he was associate publisher, general manager of The Forward, the most influential Jewish newspaper in the country.
Okay, and I will introduce Bob. Bob Gelbach lives in Saugerties. He's a graduate of Wesleyan and has a PhD in political science from Yale. He grew up in New Jersey in Temple Bet Shalom, which his parents helped found. And he wanted us to say this is the 60th anniversary of his bar mitzvah. 68th anniversary, sorry. Okay. his longtime anti-racism work began during the civil rights movement, and it was motivated by his Jewish religious education. He was a professor of political science at Southern Connecticut State University. And then after retiring in 2002, he became the executive director of something called EMDR, Humanitarian Assistance Program, HAP, which was a nonprofit disaster response and clinical training program that operates internationally. So Bob's introduction to Palestine and to issues of Palestine came with the training of Palestinian clinicians in the West Bank, and they became the first certified such trainers in the Arabic-speaking world. So in 2013, Bob visited Israel, Palestine to visit those communities where HAP was working to treat PTSD. He visited again in 2015, co-leading a tour with a minister and an imam. And he also, at that time, became an active member of Jewish Voice for Peace, the co-founder of New Haven Jewish Voice for Peace chapter. And then when he moved to Saugerties shortly afterwards, he co-founded the Hudson Valley JVP. He's also a member of the Ulster County Democratic Committee, the Saugerties Democratic Committee, and the coordinating committee of the Ulster Immigrant Defense Network. And if you want to read more about Bob, take a look at the UCFJ's website, which has a page on this program today. Our first question for discussion is, why have Palestinians refused to come to terms with Israel?
I want to say thank everybody for attending in person and online. We're trying to bring back a tradition that used to exist in the United States a long time ago called civil discourse. And I have an eminent partner here in this discussion. I'm very pleased that we're going to take part in this. And at the end, perhaps we'll have forged a roadmap to peace. Pressure's on.
And so before I begin, I'd like to echo those sentiments. I hope that we will continue having conversations. I think this one is probably going to be very candid and straightforward. We're not going to hold off on anything in our initial presentations, and we'll see how our conversation goes at that point. I am very grateful to the Ulster Jewish Federation for agreeing to co-sponsor this. We started preparing for this back in January. This baby is now 9 months old and ready to be born. So, are you ready?
Yes.
Why haven't Palestinians come to terms with Israelis? Palestinians cannot come to terms with Israel because Israel's terms keep changing, while its goal remains the same. Zionists in power continue to press for total dominance over the Palestinian land and people. Palestinians in the late 19th century were literally minding their own business in territory they had inhabited as farmers and small city dwellers for more than 1,000 years. They had no government to advocate for them. They'd been ruled by the distant Ottoman Turks for 400 years. They welcomed people of many cultures, including a longtime Jewish community. By contrast, the Zionists who created Israel were an ethnic nationalist movement, motivated by a surge of anti-Semitism that drove 3 million East European Jews to leave for other countries between 1880 and 1920. Only about 2% of them actually took up the Zionist invitation to go to Palestine. Unlike earlier Zionists who had cultural and religious reasons for emigrating to Palestine, the political Zionists were convinced that European-style ethnic nationalism was the way to make life safe for Jews. They held that a people should live together with their own kind in their native territory. Foreign influences were not to be trusted. But European Jews were scattered over many lands. They were a people without a land, and they needed to find, in one quote, a land without a people. Spoiler alert, there were no lands without people. So the political Zionists turned to yet another European practice, settler colonialism. For 3 centuries, Europeans seeking to better life for themselves had taken over the territory of other peoples who were not strong enough to resist. The results were the nation states of the US and the rest of the Western Hemisphere, as well as Australia, New Zealand, and parts of Africa. The price of settler colonialism was the destruction of the indigenous culture, expulsion of the natives, and even genocide. The political Zionists understood this and applied it to Palestine. They wanted to gain all the land, but only to transfer all the Palestinians to somewhere else. Palestinians also soon understood that the Zionists aimed to take over their country and move them out. Here's a comment by Joseph Weitz, one of the early Zionist leaders in the 1930s in Palestine. He said, "There is no room in the country for both peoples. The only solution is a land of Israel without Arabs. There is no way but to transfer the Arabs from here to the neighboring countries, to transfer all of them. Not one village must be left, not one tribe." The Zionists lobbied continuously for support from other nations. In 1948, the UN General Assembly recommended partitioning Palestine between the two populations. Palestinians, who were 70% of the population, objected, but Israel declared its independence in mid-May. 6 months earlier, in December of 1947, Zionist militias had already begun attacking peaceful villages. They were not responding to any local threat. This was the beginning of Plan Dalet, a secret plan for the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians through force and terrorism. Neighboring Arab states sent small military forces to protect Palestinians, and a war broke out. Over 700,000 people, half the Palestinians, were uprooted and sent into exile by Israel before the war ended. 500 villages were emptied, and many were burned and bulldozed to prevent return. This is what Palestinians call the Nakba, the catastrophe. By the war's end, Israel controlled 78% of Palestine. Ethnic cleansing had lowered the proportion of Palestinians in the Israeli population to about 20%. Palestinian citizens of Israel were isolated under military rule. Then in 1967, Israel occupied all the rest of Palestine, Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem. In the whole territory, Palestinians were now as numerous as Jews. An occupying power is obliged to safeguard the occupied population, restore local government, and leave quickly. But Israel has been an occupier for 55 years so far. Occupiers may not remove valuable resources, build new infrastructure, or establish new settlements. All of these obligations have been continuously violated. Israel continuously presses Palestinians to leave the rural areas and go to the underdeveloped cities, while converting the freed up land into Jewish settlements. As Israel's Prime Minister Yair Lapid put it, the goal is, quote, maximum Jews on maximum land with maximum security and minimum Palestinians in the Jewish areas. Residents under pressure try to fight back. Oops. Their stories are increasingly being distributed and heard in civil societies outside the Middle East. Palestinian resistance to Zionism is gaining supporters worldwide. In response, Israel argues that Zionism is an essential part of Jewish identity, and anti-Zionism is therefore anti-Semitic. But in fact, political Zionism is an ethnic nationalist movement from 19th century Eastern Europe, married to European-style settler colonialism. As a growing number of progressive Jews will tell you, you don't need to be a political Zionist to be a good Jew. And to answer the question we started with, Palestinians cannot come to terms with Israel so long as the Zionists in power are still not done pressing for total dominance over the Palestinian land and people. I'll stop there.
And do we go to mine or the two-minute rebuttal?
There's nothing to, pardon? Is he doing a 2-minute rebuttal, or is he doing a 7.5-minute intro?
No, we do the rebuttals and then we do the, we take this.
Right. So I do a 2-minute rebuttal now. Wow, there's a lot to unpack there. What do I do with my 2 minutes? Just because one political Zionist makes a racist statement, that doesn't make it government policy. as I'm willing to show through verifiable facts that was not Ben-Gurion's vision of what was going to happen. I reject the notion that Israel looks for total dominance of the Palestinian people. And there's going to be a lot more opportunity to get into this, but Israel is not an occupying nation in the West Bank. It's as simple as this. If I steal your car and sell it to my brother-in-law, is it my brother-in-law's car? No, it's still your car. You can't pass along better title to something than you already have. If the Palestinians, if the West Bank was actually occupied territory, Palestinians would, by definition, have to be Jordanian citizens. But Jordan made it quite clear that they're not. Okay, they didn't want them. They benefit from keeping the Palestinians in a state of perpetual refugee status. This was disputed territory. International law, before the Jordanians took it, they decided to give it up. You can't give it up and give it to somebody else. Turns out that the West Bank and international law governing this is that you have to respect the national boundaries of the last ruling power, which was the Ottoman Empire. The legal case under international law for Israel's ownership of the of this disputed portion of land is really quite clear. But as you will hear from my statement, there's an overriding factor in why that's okay. I'm done. I'm okay.
Okay, and I guess, Bob, you have also 2 minutes, right, or no?
No, I get mine, and
I get mine,
then he gets
I
to
respond
rebut mine.
Dave.
Okay, go for it.
Thank you.
We got it straight.
Right.
Good job.
Thank you very much. All right, let's start with something we'll agree on. Failed negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians result in misery for both sides. Agreed? But the reason peace is not broken out between these perennial combatants isn't because of any particular Palestinian grievances like the 2% of West Bank territory represented by settlements. I'll say again, settlements in what my opponent might call the West Bank, and I would more accurately call Judea and Samaria, represent max 2% of the land of what Jewish Voice would peace would likely have you believe is occupied territory. Nor is the issue Jerusalem, Judaism's holy city, a place in which Muhammad never set foot. It's a more vexing problem. Palestinians refuse to recognize Israel as the Jewish state. Judaism and Islam are both Abrahamic religions, but establishing a Jewish state is somehow a Nakba, a catastrophe. It's purely anti-Semitism. Look at the Oslo Accords. In 1993, US brokered agreement between Israel and the PLO, explicitly stating the Palestinians and Israelis would put aside the argument over sovereignty. This was intended as the watershed peacemaking event. The parties would later compromise on major issues like borders, Jerusalem, so-called refugee return. History reveals Yasser Arafat bargained in bad faith. They haven't recognized the national rights of the Jewish people, and for the purposes of this discussion, I won't dwell on the fact that PA has not adhered to any other commitments made in Oslo. Foreign Affairs magazine noted in 2011 that Palestinian refusal to negotiate settlement construction beyond the 1967 lines was, and I quote, a dubious claim given the Palestinians have never made halting construction a precondition before. And when Israel did freeze building, they still refused to come to the table. It's a hard truth the pro-Palestinian community needs to face up to. The hostile posture of the Palestinians towards Israel has nothing to do with settlements or another contrived controversy. While I acknowledge the Palestinians face hardships due to security measures like fences and checkpoints, that's not a political issue, but a painful reality based on legit safety concerns. There are 50 Muslim countries, all have some variant theocratic influence, a Western-style democratic Jewish state following the rule of law for all citizens, including Muslims and Christians, that recognizes the rights of women and is viewed as one of the world's most LGBTQ plus friendly nations, is abhorrent to them. Think about that. They won't recognize even one Jewish state besides clear historical, archaeological, and religious ties to the land, nor the agreements among the Allied powers that shaped the entire Middle East after World War I, the same powers that ceded the Arabian Peninsula to a British ally, Ibn Saud, who created Saudi Arabia. It's the world's second largest oil producer, hence the outside influence of OPEC on international affairs. Notice nobody in the Arab world complains about that. Then Israel PM Netanyahu once said, told the US Congress rather, it has never been about the establishment of a Palestinian state. The Palestinians have been unwilling to accept a Palestinian state if it meant accepting a Jewish state alongside it. If that were not true, why have they refused the two-state solution every one of the 3 times it's been offered? Could it be Palestinian self-determination, aided by a supportive economic partner with security assurances from the United States, isn't the end game? When they proclaim the future as a Palestinian nation from the river to the sea, is it possible they mean precisely what they say? The truth is, the greater Arab world has trapped the Palestinians in perennial refugee status for political reasons originally exacerbated by anti-Semitic passages of the Quran and Cold War maneuvering. Even the Jordanians have refused them, though by right they should be citizens there. You can't have it both ways. If the West Bank is occupied, the Palestinians are Jordanian citizens, but Jordan explicitly denied their citizenship. If you closely follow the news, you may surmise the entire Arab world is inching towards normalization of relations with Israel. Why is that? You're bound to ask. It's the threat posed by Iran, viewed by the whole region as an irrational actor about to achieve offensive nuclear capabilities. The modern world requires we abandon an anachronistic geopolitical worldview in favor of one fueled by military and economic cooperation against a common enemy. This leaves the Palestinians isolated and feeling exposed. That's a bad combo for Israel. Hamas sees the writing on the wall and will violently lash out. We hope the Palestinians choose to reevaluate the status quo before it causes more grief. But please stop pretending it's all just harmless rhetoric to achieve a political goal. That's hypocrisy. The intifadas, the Katyusha rockets fired at yet residential neighborhoods, the cash stipends paid to the families of terrorists who murdered Israelis, and horrifically, the television programming that incites impressionable children to hunt and kill Jews all speak to a reality at odds with the one propounded by anti-Israel propagandists. Israel has so far survived, surrounded by hostile neighbors, because of its defense capability. It must, of necessity, be so. Consider that Hamas is largely supported by Iran, the world's leading exporter of international terrorism. Nobody thinks. Remember what Golda Meir said: we can forgive the Arabs for killing our children. We cannot forgive them for forcing us to kill theirs. We'll only have peace when they love their children more than they hate us. Hatred of the Jews is the problem. Recognition of the Jewish state is likely the only feasible answer. Later, I will get to what I think the answer is. Thank you.
I now have a
2.5 minutes.
a 2-minute rebuttal. And David, I kind of remember what you said back when you said it a while ago, but it's been a while. There are only a few things that I want to take up, although I'd love a number of other issues I would love to take up with you. Maybe if we have another event, we can go in greater depth.
I hope so as well.
The use of the term contested to describe the territory has been an Israeli method for a long time. But the reality is that The territory that Israel took over in 1967 was the remaining territory that the UN General Assembly had recommended to be shared between Israel and the Palestinians. It was territory that had previously been a mandated responsibility of the British. The British had surrendered their mandate to the United Nations. So the status of the property at that point was not Israeli, not Palestinian, and certainly not Jordanian. And when a military power occupies a territory to which it has no claim, that is called an occupied territory. The rules about occupation are designed to make sure that occupiers don't behave badly. Staying there for 55 years is a kind of example of badly. There are other examples as well that we have seen. You're not supposed to, for example, take important material resources out of the country. Israel has been siphoning water out of the aquifers in the occupied territory for quite some time. You're not supposed to bring in your own infrastructure and your own constructions, but Israel has built a whole network of highways, including segregated highways into the West Bank. Let me turn to another part of what you had to say, and that regarding the West Bank. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm losing my thought here. I'm out of time anyway. Okay, maybe later.
Well, you don't get to rebut the rebuttal, so we're moving on.
Yes, we'll move on.
The next question is, what is apartheid? Does Israel meet the definition of an apartheid state?
This time, I think
Dave was
will
first.
go
Okay.
first, and
I
Bob will respond.
can go first, but as I said when we were setting up, I will defer.
No, I think it's a great
Okay.
idea. And I want to get used to the idea of going second.
Okay. So I believe the technical definitions of apartheid hold little value as a starting point. What vision of Israeli society is conjured up when one hears that characterization of the Holy Land? Tarring Israel with that brush implies Israeli Arabs are analogous to blacks in apartheid South Africa. Are they? Remember the black judge appointed to South Africa's highest court? They're worn on. In Israel, the first Arab Supreme Court justice was Salim Gibran. Remember the black doctor who apartheid was recognized as the premier breast cancer surgeon in the world? That obviously never happened. Today, it describes a Muslim Arab woman in Israel, Dr. Salma Abu Fu. It's an inconvenient truth for proponents of the apartheid libel that Arabs and Jews constitute half of all Israel's new medical licenses. Don't ever forget the black South African don't ever forget the black South African Army General and Brigade Commander. My heavy-handed sarcasm leads you to suspect that never happened. In Israel, there is Arab Major General Ghassan Alian, an officer in the IDF Central Command. Remember during apartheid when a black political party joined a parliamentary coalition to unseat the prime minister? Laughably impossible. Now, an Arab political party helped usher PM Netanyahu into forced retirement. Is that what apartheid looks like? Israel is the only democracy in the region. All citizens enjoy freedom of speech, equal access to the courts, healthcare, and education under the law. That's true for all Jews, Muslims, and Christians. Why? Because it's a nation of laws modeled on Western European government and jurisprudence. Is Israel perfect? No. Is the US, UK, Germany, France, or Canada? No. There's bias, there's cooperation, there's wealth, there's poverty, there's vast political conflict, and there's surprising coalitions formed in pursuit of common goals. Let's compare with Israel's Muslim neighbors. Do women enjoy equal rights, including the right to serve in combat like women in Israel? Remember Saudi Arabia, they have oil. We don't criticize them much. Saudi women finally have driver's licenses, but women must wear a long robe and headscarf outside and limit the time spent around men in public places, even banks and universities. They need a man's permission to open a bank account, apply for a passport, or leave the house. Women don't have legal custody of a child once the child reaches a certain age. 9 for girls, 7 for boys. Think about that, my friends. Saudi women in 2022 celebrate driver's licenses. Israel elected a woman prime minister in 1969, which is the apartheid nation. Let's look at the LGBTQ plus community in Israel. Israel was the first country in Asia to recognize same-sex unions. Same-sex sexual activity is legal. Same-sex couples may jointly adopt. LGBTQ people serve openly in the military. What are LGBTQ policies in Arab countries? Male same-sex activity is punishable by imprisonment in Kuwait, Egypt, Oman, and Syria. Punishable by death in Iran, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates. In Yemen and Gaza, the punishment is more progressive. Death or imprisonment, depending. Which is apartheid? Here's an example of an apartheid country, Palestine, where the government practices apartheid against Jews. George Mason law professor Eugene Kontorovich, you knew he was coming, noted in the Wall Street Journal, the Israel apartheid myth is despicable. It's not just a lie, it's an inversion of the truth. In areas controlled by Israel, Jews and Arabs mix openly. All areas of Gaza and the West Bank under PA jurisdiction are Jew-free. Not one Jewish community under Palestinian control. They'd exist 10 minutes from Jerusalem if it weren't for PA policies of exclusion and incitement. Under Palestinian law, selling land to Jews is a crime punishable by death. An imam said on TV, this land is a pure right of its Muslim owners, the people of Palestine. A PA official said, whoever sells real estate to the enemy is a traitor, and all those who commit this crime must be punished. In areas controlled by the PA, Jews cannot worship at holy sites. Even in areas under Israeli control, like the Temple Mount, Jews can't pray because the PA threatens mass violence if Jews defile it with their filthy feet. That's from Israel's peace partner, Mahmoud Abbas. Their constitution defines Palestine as an exclusively Arab nation. Islam is the official religion, Arabic the official language. By contrast, in Israel, Arabic enjoys official status. There are no synagogues. In Palestine, there are 400 mosques in Israel, 74 in Jerusalem. Remind me, which is apartheid? Late Senator Dan Moynihan said everyone is entitled to his own opinion, but not to his own facts. Here are verifiable facts. In Israel, Arabs have equal voting rights. Where else do Arab women vote? One legal distinction, Arabs are not required to serve in the IDF, so they won't have to fight brethren. Thousands volunteer. Construction and trucking are dominated by Arabs. 38% of pharmacists are Arab. At the super farm chain, it's 62%. 50% of nursing students are Arabs. There's the Arab Employment Initiative, a partnership between the government, the Joint Distribution Committee, and Yad Hanadiv, a Rothschild-funded NGO. There are 20+ employment centers to help Arabs find employment. Survey says 81% of Jews and 96% of Arabs would happily accept the other as work colleagues. A high percentage of Arab women, especially, are professionals, mainly in healthcare and education. Show me apartheid if you can. You cannot. It's inaccurate. It's insensitive to Black Africans who lived under brutal apartheid rule. It's a slander when said and a libel when written. Is there lingering bias against minorities? Yes, same as the US. Is there room for improvement? Absolutely, same as the US. things are getting better for Israeli Arabs, note the impact of Ram, the previously mentioned Arab political party. There is no statutory system of apartheid. It's not even a common grudge amongst Arab Israelis. What they mostly want is better employment opportunities, same as the US.
Yeah, looking for this water.
Thank you. I'd love another glass if I can.
Okay, so we now go to what, 2-minute rebuttal?
So,
No, you have 7.5 minutes.
No,
No,
2 minutes.
you have rebuttal and then you get to make
and
your
then I make
presentation.
my.
You get to say, I love
There were a lot of statements that you made. I could not begin to write my notes fast enough to take them all down, let alone check on them. Though there were some that I pretty clearly know were not quite my understanding. Let me try to focus on a couple of issues. And it really takes us back to the business about contested territory.
Thank you.
One of the things about calling the territory contested is that you can,
Disputed, actually. I'm sorry.
well, disputed, contested,
Yeah.
you say tomato and I say tomato, but the basic idea is as long as it's not definitely Israel, then the way you treat people there is not an example of the way you treat people in Israel. If it is, on the other hand, not Israel, then the rules for occupiers apply. So you jump back and forth, one jumps back and forth between those two categories in order to avoid responsibility for what's going on. But the reality is that in the occupied territories, the pattern of I got distracted for a moment. In those territories, the pattern of apartheid is pretty clear, pretty clearly present. Also, there are something like 50 statutes in Israel that distinguish between Jews and non-Jews in a way that the apartheid law applies. So, you know, we really have to take a closer look at all of those questions. I'll try to address some of it in what I have to say in my presentation. I'll stop there.
I believe the floor is yours.
The floor is mine. What is, again, what is apartheid and is Israel an apartheid state? The term apartheid was the name used by the Afrikaner government in South Africa for the policy of racial separation and domination imposed upon the native South African population. Over time, native South Africans resisted and defeated the apartheid regime. But in 1973, the UN General Assembly endorsed the International Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid. That convention defined apartheid for all of the legal application purposes that we have today as a policies and practices by which a government identifies a racial or ethnic group within its jurisdiction, separates that group for special treatment, and thereby limits the human rights and liberties of members of the group solely on the basis of race or ethnicity. That's what apartheid means in law, regardless of what it might have meant before. The fact that the United States was never accused of apartheid before we ended segregation in this country is an accident of history. But under the terms of the definition, the US would have been an apartheid state. So how does this apply to Israel? Until 1948, Israel did not exist as a nation state, but the Zionist settler movement promoted ethnic separation, avoided relationships with Palestinians, and actively lobbied for preferential treatment when Britain ruled Palestine under a League of Nations mandate. Once Israel was created, preferential treatment for Jews became governmental policy and law. Palestinian refugees created by ethnic cleansing were refused permission to return to their homes, while Jews from anywhere were immediately welcomed and assisted to immigrate. Military military government was imposed on Palestinians inside Israel, preventing them from retrieving their land and properties. That continued for 18 years. These properties were seized by Israel and given to the Jewish National Fund for reallocation to Jews only. Other Palestinian lands were seized for military use. Economic development policies and social services favored Jewish areas. Villages and neighborhoods were segregated. Housing and school support favored Jewish areas. In 1966, Israel lifted the military government over its Palestinian citizens, but there remains about 50 major laws in Israel that discriminate between Jews and Palestinians, or Jews and non-Jews. In 1967, Israel invaded and occupied Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. In 6 days, the Zionists achieved their goal of holding all of historic Palestine. But now the unwanted Palestinian share of total population had soared from 20% to 50%. Apartheid policies in the occupied Palestine territories, I'm going to call it the OPT for short, were Israel's response. Military government, the IDF, is imposed on all Palestinians, while Israeli Jewish settlers in the OPT are governed by Israeli civil law. The IDF does not answer to regular courts if its regulations and actions are challenged. Israel seized as state land any Palestinian land that had been uncultivated or temporarily abandoned in the past. Confiscated lands are made available to Jewish settlements for both residential and commercial or industrial use. No comparable support is provided to Palestinians. Permits for buildings or renovations are almost impossible for Palestinians to get. Thousands of structures built or modified without a permit have been destroyed with all their contents by IDF bulldozers. Israel has built segregated road networks that link OPT Jewish settlements to each other and to Israel, while isolating Palestinian cities from each other and frequently separating villages from their fields. Jewish people and businesses move easily between Israel and the OPT. Palestinians must pass through multiple checkpoints with long wait times to go from place to place. Jewish settlers in the West Bank increasingly pressure surrounding villages and farms to abandon their locations. Physical attacks on Palestinian farms and crops are common, and the IDF often supports the settlers or prevents the Palestinians from fighting back. Israel frequently resorts to collective punishment without trial, as when it destroys the houses of family members when a Palestinian is accused of armed rebellion against Israeli occupation. The biggest example of collective punishment is the treatment of Gaza, since Israel pulled settlers out of that territory in 2005. The entire civilian population of over 2 million people is continuously under siege and has been repeatedly attacked, militarily attacked. Gaza has been realistically compared to a giant prison, and the attacks have been cited as war crimes by neutral experts. Taken as a whole, the Israeli regime in the OPT is one of dramatic inequality between Jews and Palestinians, enforced by state laws and policy. Major international human rights organizations have looked closely at Israel's conduct and concluded that it amounts to a policy of apartheid. These agencies include Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and the Israeli organization, B'Tselem. Palestinians have attempted to go before international courts with their complaints, but Israel has avoided judgment by refusing to recognize the courts or their jurisdiction. Long ago, Zionists assumed that once they gained control over the land of Israel, the unwanted Palestinians would somehow transfer away. That did not happen. Palestinians remain in large numbers, while 3 million more Palestinians live in refugee camps outside historic Palestine and have a legal right to return. In short, the Zionist problem since 1967 has been what to do with unwanted Palestinians. And the record is clear. Israel has chosen to be an apartheid state.
David, 2 minutes.
Well, there really is even more to unpack there. I was surprised when my opponent mentioned International Convention at the UN in 1973 that everybody didn't break out laughing. They consider Israel the biggest human rights offender in the world. Iran, nothing in Africa, nothing else anywhere. It seems to be on their agenda. It's for political reasons, very anti-Semitic organization. We all know it. I wouldn't bring them into this discussion. Wow. There's this thing about expulsion, which I'll get into. But the truth is, and it's in my formal presentation, the Palestinians were not expelled in 1948 by government edict. That's just not really defensible. 50 laws he talks about against Palestinians. I suppose those are all laws about what neighborhoods are allowed to live in, all of them.
Some of them.
Okay, that really has to do with the ethnic character of the of that region of the country. Don't be ethnocentric about this. The Palestinians want Judenrein. They want a land with no Jews whatsoever. There's really no proportionality in that argument, and that creating roads between Jewish settlements is somehow a big deal. Again, I'll say, please go home, look it up for yourself. All Jewish settlements are only about 2% of all the West Bank. And frankly, to talk about Gaza as being a prison, Gaza is ruled by Hamas, which is recognized by the State Department and almost all Western governments. It is a terrorist organization supported by Iran.
Thank you.
All right, so we're on to our third question, and I just want to remind people of the questions. Or if you want to hear something more discussed, it's up to you to put it on an index card or put it in the chat. The next question is, we entering the 75th year since Israel was established as a state. What realistically must be done to establish a just peace? And if I'm correct, I think that Bob is first, or is that correct? Yes.
Okay, what would it take to establish a just peace between Israel and the Palestinians? There are two questions here, really. First, what would a just peace look like? And second, how do we get from here to there? What has always been needed for a just peace is the reversal of settler colonialism. Forms of domination need to end. Human and political rights of all residents, Palestinians and Jews, need to be respected. Reparations are needed for refugees and those whose property was seized and redistributed. At the end of the day, all residents of historic Palestine need to live in a society that respects the rights of all individuals and all cultures, in a society that is the nation of all its citizens. You know, the Palestinian member of the Knesset in the last few years has tried to introduce a proposal in which the entire Knesset would simply say, we agree that the nation of Israel is the nation of all its citizens. And each time the Jewish leader of the Knesset has said, that's not a permitted thing to discuss or debate or vote on, because Israel is not a nation of all its citizens. It's a Jewish nation. So it's a serious issue. But Zionist settler colonialism is already very advanced and accelerating. Israeli politicians compete to show who will extend settlements in the West Bank more rapidly. And yet this is also a time when Palestinian resistance is growing rapidly and in ever more effective forms. Palestinians have always displayed sumud, steadfastness, sometimes passively resisting domination, at other times resisting more overtly and building political movements to clash with Israeli power. They've often been urged by outsiders to rely on negotiations with Israel, which sometimes led to changes in the structure of the occupation, but not to its end. Since Oslo II, for example, Israel has recognized the Palestinian Authority to govern inside the larger cities of the OPT, while continuing to grow settlements. In effect, the PA has become a contracted police force in cities that are cut off from opportunities for economic development, while Israel pressures villagers in the larger territory to abandon their lands and move to those cities. Vague promises in Oslo II that a two-state solution might arise out of the PA's work are no longer credible. There are now over 700,000 Jewish settlers in the OPT. The numbers are growing and they're not going to leave. Each time the parties have sat to negotiate, Israel's position has been, in effect, what's mine is mine and what's yours is negotiable. What will you give up today? How is it possible to move beyond this impasse? There's no guarantee that this can be accomplished, but if it has a chance, it will not depend on persuading Israeli Zionists to change their preferences. Rather, it requires that Palestinian opposition groups grow and merge and find outside allies that can pressure Israel to change its practices. That is what the African National Congress did in the struggle against Afrikaner apartheid. And that may be now emerging in the Middle East, both inside historic Palestine and in the Palestinian diaspora. There are a record number of groups engaged in research, advocacy, public relations, all telling the Palestinian story to the civil societies of the world, to religious groups, cultural organizations, university faculties and students, news media, labor unions, and human rights groups in other countries. Through this heightened advocacy, public opinion is changing, even within Jewish communities, especially among the young, and even in Israel. Today, there are Jewish Israelis joining West Bank farmers to help with the olive harvest and provide a buffer against settler harassment. Young Israelis are refusing to serve in the IDF, and IDF veterans have reached out to former Palestinian opponents. The Israel Committee Against House Demolition continues a long history of resisting demolition by showing up in person to challenge the IDF bulldozers. Opinion leaders around the world who hear the evidence become advocates for ending the occupation, for the right of refugees and their families to return to their homes or receive compensation, and for eliminating laws that discriminate against non-Jewish Israeli citizens. Public opinion alone will not pressure Israel. But if the South African experience is any guide, world opinion does finally move governments in other countries to take a stand. Of course, increased Palestinian opposition to Zionism also stokes intense Israeli effort to counteract it. In countries like the US, this takes the form of Israel attacking anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism and reaching out to cultural groups that are untroubled by colonialism and apartheid, such as right-wing evangelicals and racist political factions. This year, AIPAC has helped fund campaigns for 109 Republican House candidates who voted against affirming the 2020 presidential election, who appealed to racist groups, and who are more reliably pro-Israel than their Democratic opponents. Israel also responds by increasing internal pressure on Palestinian communities and advocacy organizations. Political demonstrations in the OPT have faced increased IDF interference, arrests of leaders, and intimidating IDF acts, like the so-called mistake of killing journalist Shireen Abu Akleh and the disruption of her funeral. A year ago, Israel officially condemned without cause 6 highly regarded Palestinian advocacy groups as terrorist organizations, and periodically since then, their offices have been invaded and the papers and documents there torn up by the IDF. As world opinion shifts towards Palestinians, Israel's responses are similar to South Africa's early response to the African National Congress as that apartheid system began to crumble. There's no assurance that Israel's critics will be as successful, but that does appear to be the most likely way that a just resolution can be achieved in the Israel-Palestine conflict. And without justice, a nation for all its citizens, there is little chance for peace.
Thank you.
So my initial response to that is oy vey. Yes. Shin Bet did close down 6 otherwise considered human rights organizations because they were of their ties to recognized terrorist organizations. It's a fact. I wrote a whole article about it. You can find it online if you look for it, but I'd be happy to make it available to anybody else. They're terrorist front organizations. So he suggests, my professor Gelbach suggests that Palestinian groups, opposition groups, make alliances with friendly organizations. The problem is this: we're going to, the Palestinians are clearly getting isolated in the entire Arab world, which I will talk to more, but there's really no help coming for the Palestinians if they want to continue their, especially Hamas's policy of terrorism to drive the Jews from the land and have a Palestinian country that is all Muslim from the river to the sea, which is what they say over and over again that they want. And the leader of the Knesset, you know, if you watch the news and you see how Liz Truss is already out, you understand that in a parliamentary government, the leader is a chairman of a party that was able to build a coalition. Okay, that's just not, it's just not a tangible argument. And I guess I'm done, right? I guess that was the end.
Well, now we have questions for.
Yeah, no, I have to make my, I get a presentation.
Oh,
Okay. It's easy to say what the end game isn't. Jews aren't leaving. A Palestinian nation from river to sea isn't a viable option. It never had to be this way. From its inception, Israel did not want war. Ben-Gurion believed Jewish and Arab farmers would find common ground around mutual economic challenges. In retrospect, that's naive. But he proposed creating a local Arab League of several nations, including Israel, similar to Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg in the European Economic Community. This arrangement, just like the Benelux Politico-Economic Union, would have been a formal intergovernmental cooperative entity and a practical incentive for peace. What went wrong? The British Mandatory Authorities Arab attaché loved the idea, but it was immediately vetoed by Syria. A brief but essential historical note here. Israeli Arabs weren't expelled by Jews in 1948. They were told to leave by the neighboring Arab countries. Those countries wanted Arabs out of the way when they invaded, and they promised these refugees they would be returning to a Jew-free Israel within a few weeks. The government beseeched the Arab community to stay. The Economist newspaper, historically no friend to Israel, published a contemporaneous account of the mayor of Haifa standing on the highway, literally begging them to turn back. History reveals that didn't work out for the hostile Arab nations, nor Palestinians stuck in permanent refugee status ever since. It's plagued Israel for 75 years. I share this so you appreciate Israel didn't benefit from the exodus of Arab residents from Israeli society. There's a cogent argument for the Palestinians to simply lay down their arms and abandon the notion of independence. They'd be an Arab minority integral to the fabric of Israeli society. They take up their rightful place as a huge and powerful voting bloc in the Israeli political process, enjoying the rights under law afforded all citizens. Women and gays would benefit in that scenario immediately. Decades of violence, hateful rhetoric, and incompatible religious strictures suggest that boat sailed. Given the history, it's a non-starter for most Israelis, and it's obviously not popular with Palestinians. So where to begin? Consider what has already been agreed to but never came to pass. The Oslo Accords laid out steps towards peaceful resolution. Oslo acknowledged recognition of Palestine as a political entity and Israel as the Jewish state. It anticipated demilitarization. Consider the sections regarding legal affairs and cooperation, which say Israel and the Council shall exercise their powers and responsibilities with due regard to internationally accepted norms and principles of human rights and the rule of law. Both sides will abstain from incitement, including hostile propaganda. If you already believe that Israel is the bad actor, I'm unlikely to change your mind. If you think fault lies largely with militant Palestinians, I agree. It's absurd to believe Palestinian terrorists were likely to embrace this prescription for peace. Firing missiles at non-combatants is literally terrorism. Israel's military posture is defensive and understandably retaliatory. The IDF was characterized as, quote, the most ethical army in the world, unquote, by a council made up of senior military officers from 5 continents and a UN war crimes prosecutor. Hamas and others' military strategy centers on guerrilla tactics and civilian targeted attacks. No matter your beliefs, can we agree adhering to the spirit of Oslo is one place to start? If so, let's consider demilitarization. A good faith peace begins with disbanding all terrorist organizations. There's a historical model for this. The UK ended the Troubles with Northern Ireland when the political climate made continued violence untenable. The IRA and Ulster loyalists laid down their weapons while Sinn Féin negotiated. Analogously, terrorist factions in Gaza must follow a similar path, cede their influence to the PA, and the PA must negotiate in good faith. Palestinian leadership must stop diverting billions in foreign aid to building terror tunnels into Israel. Plus, Palestinians must end their intransigence on access to Jewish religious sites. When Israel manages a site, every religion has access. When Palestinians manage sites, only Muslims have unfettered access, and Jewish sites are frequently vandalized. That leaves only one plan on the table, the two-state solution. Under this model, the Palestinians get an independent country, a committed economic partner with skin in the game, and security assurances from the United States and other stakeholders. What will Israel compromise? Curtailing settlements and land swaps will be major political victories. Israel will make huge capital investments in infrastructure, unprecedented job creation, and improved healthcare and education. The risk for Israel that they will have empowered an enemy state just a few miles from every major strategic target. Investing faith in Palestinian leadership be one of the greatest compromises made in history to achieve peace. But that's a roadmap for peace. It's as simple as saying yes to an Israeli-US brokered Palestinian nation in Gaza and the West Bank. Given the indoctrination to Jew hatred by Palestinian government and media, virulent anti-Semitism at the UN, plus prejudices based on anti-Semitic interpretations of the Quran, I am not sanguine regarding the prospects. The PA junta is a perennial dictatorship, despite the provisions of its own constitution. Even Israel hater Amnesty International acknowledges the PA and Hamas violently stifled dissent, resorting to arbitrary detention, torture, and excessive force against protesters. Civilians are tried before military courts, and vaccine distribution favors high-ranking officials over health workers. My one hope is that normalization of relations is accelerating. The Abraham Accord suggested is, eventually, a new generation of Palestinians tired of war and isolated from the Arab world will adopt a new perspective if, and that's a big if, that's what they truly want. If they truly do want it, it's there for the taking.
Bob, would you like to respond?
I'm sure Bob would like to respond.
Sure. Again, quite a lengthy list, and I'm not really going to be able to address all or most of it. I do think when we say that firing missiles at non-combatants is definitely a war crime, That certainly is the sort of thing we might want to point out to the Israeli military as it goes for the umpteenth time over Gaza and continues its bombardments of civilian targets with the excuse that somewhere down in the basement there might be a terrorist that they've got to go after, and that's the only way to do it. There are a number of other matters of that sort that I'd want to pick up if I could remember them all. I do want to take issue with the suggestion that the people who left in 1947 and 48 from their villages were told to leave. There's a very explicit plan Dalit that was developed by the pre-Israel militia forces and the Zionist leadership. It was based on research that had been done by the mandate power, Britain, in the years leading up to then. And it specifically looked at all the information about each of the villages and was used by the Israelis and the Zionists before there was an Israel to identify the villages they wanted to go after. They went into a number of villages and literally massacred the people who were there in such a way that surrounding villages would hear about it and know that hundreds of people were brought out into a public place and shot down, men, women, and in some cases children. That was enough to terrify non-combatants to leave. We could go through many further examples, but let's leave it at that. I'm looking forward to questions from the audience.
So I think that we have some questions both from the audience and from the Zoom. And
Please, can you give me a second here? Let me, the Zoom people over here are going.
Hold on one
So
second.
I'm gonna mute the camera one.
We have some questions both from the audience and from the Zoom. Ron and I have looked at them.
Yeah.
And some of them are repetitive. Some of them are statements. We're not going to do statements, but we are going to do questions. And if I can, I just would like to say in preface that inside the Jewish community is a place this discussion needs to take place. So I'm really, really happy that even though when I look at the chat and so forth, I see people like whoa, freaking out about things that are being said. I'm really happy that we're saying them to each other as opposed to not being willing to talk. So I just wanted to say that for starters.
Amen.
And I think Ron is going to give the first question, and I think each of you should, take a minute or just a minute or so to respond.
Yeah. This one's interesting because this one also came from somebody in Florida, and it was just brought up here by you, right? And yes, you didn't.
Oh, yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. Okay. When Israel blows up Palestinian terrorist houses in retaliation for an attack, is it overkill? Is it counterproductive?
Okay, hold on one second. You, please.
I'll be happy to take that one first if you want.
Go ahead.
Okay, no, it's not even proportional. You kill, if you're a terrorist and you kill a civilian, a non-combatant, and you arrest them, you're coming from a culture where you have to understand there are two things going on. One, to kill an Israeli who and be killed in return or be imprisoned for it, you're a martyr, and your family's proud of you, and for the entire rest of their lives, they're going to receive a stipend from the PA paying them, and the amount of money that they get is literally tied to how many Jews they killed. It's so one, it's not proportional. Now, what do? They go out of their way to make sure that it's just property They leaflet that they're going to blow it up. They send out robotic phone calls in multiple languages to make sure that the people around know that they're going to blow it up. And then before they even blow it up, they do something that no other military in the world does. The Americans even tried to copy it, but they couldn't get it down right. They do a thing called the roof knock. Does everybody know what the roof knock is? They drop like an M80, they drop a little tiny explosive on the roof to say, we're not kidding around, it's coming, get out of the house.
You were talking that Israel does this, or
Israel does this. That's what Israel does. They make sure that it's property only. And terrorists need to know, terrorist families, because Palestinian culture promotes martyrdom, that there are consequences.
You know, I have known a number of Palestinians. I have visited with Palestinians in their homes. I have gotten to know them. They have gotten to know me from many different backgrounds. And I have to say, I'm not prepared to make the kind of judgments that were just made about the culture of the Palestinians and the nature of the Palestinians and the excuse of thinking that for taking actions that are simply excessive and designed really to make oneself look scary. I think, you know, Israel wants to look scary to Palestinians, so the military acts in this way. And the bottom line is, I'm talking about an action that you know, what could have been accomplished was charges brought against the person who did what was done, taking it out on the families, especially in a culture where Israel controls the possibility of, you know, building a replacement house or making a repair, is, in my mind, a very excessive way, an arbitrary way of trying to do a legitimate business of dealing with someone who has violated the law. I also want to say that we have been using the term terrorist. Dave, I think you've been using the term terrorist in a very exclusively Palestinian way, and have not considered the possibility that what is often happening on the Israeli side is a kind of terrorism directed at non-combatants, at civilians, and that's a very important part of the problem.
You'll have to explain that to the Viet Cong.
I just, one tech point, I just want to know that for this more discussion oriented part, you are both on the camera, so you know you're on the camera.
Okay, I'm going to take a question from the chat. And someone who's at home took the opportunity to try to understand more about what Israeli settlements control in the West Bank, and said that although the buildings are about 1% of the land, the jurisdiction and the rule of regional councils is about 42% of the West Bank. And she says she doesn't think that the amount occupied by settlers is really the issue. The real issue is it okay to apply military law as opposed to Palestinians, and particularly even to Palestinian children, while civil law is applied to Jewish Israelis? So I think that's a question for both of you, and take it away.
Well, I would agree with the questioner that, I would endorse the distinction that she's making, and saying that, yes, there is a problem when military law is applied to one population and civilian law to the other. And let me say also that we were talking before whether it's really apartheid. The folks who had the most immediate personal knowledge of apartheid were some of the leaders from South Africa. And over the last several years, as they've come through Israel and the West Bank and Palestine, and looked around and seen for themselves what was going on, their conclusions were unanimous. And unfortunately, those conclusions were that there was definitely apartheid in Israel, Palestine, and if anything, possibly even more extreme than what they found in South Africa before the end.
Okay, so is that your?
Yes.
Okay, so
Yeah, okay, so I do not accept the 42% figure in any way at all. It's just not correct. And also, military law, civil law, what happened to the PLO? Actually, what happened to the PLO is they sat down at Oslo and they created a Palestinian Authority. There's a Palestinian police force. Where's your Palestinian police force? I mean, it's just, I'm sorry, it's a good question, but it's based on false assumptions. And we just have to get in to doing a little bit more research about these things. So it's actually kind of a little difficult for me to continue to answer that question. And back to the apartheid, we've beat that to death. It's just not. Read the laws. Israel is a country with something called the basic laws. The basic laws are clear, and it's kind of funny. All these disputes between Israelis and Palestinians, or Israeli and Israeli Arabs, they make it all the way up to the Supreme Court. They get the day in court. It's a nation of laws. It's a nation of Western style jurisprudence. That's my answer. Read.
okay.
But I'd like to respond to that one, because I have a
I
personal
didn't know that
experience
we
of
were
it.
doing that, but okay.
They make it all the way to the Supreme Court. I went to
Is that true?
I'm going to tell you. I went to a farm in the West Bank where there is an annual program in the summertime, program for children, but also people mostly from Europe come by and participate. The place is called the Tent of Nations. There are three settlements that were developed in the vicinity right around this farm. And their goal was to get the farm to lead. And in order to do that, they challenged the claim of the owners that they had a valid deed. And they brought this to the IDF, and the IDF sided with them. And the owners said, we're really going to appeal this because we actually have a deed that goes all the way back to the Ottoman Turks. Physical deed in our possession. It's never been owned by anybody else, and we've been here continuously. They went to the Supreme Court. They went to the courts of Israel, and they got all the way to the Supreme Court of Israel. And the Supreme Court of Israel looked at the deed and said, yeah, that's right, you do have this property. Okay, they said. They went back. At the time that I was visiting them, they were just very happy about the fact that they just succeeded in the court. When I got back to the States, I followed the news, and a couple of weeks later, I read that the IDF had come into the territory and with bulldozers and whatnot, had bulldozed over their olive groves and had destroyed the farm area around them because they didn't accept the result. And nothing happened as a result of it. Nothing was done of it. They could not restore the damage because the trees were gone.
Are you sure it was the IDF? Because I've never heard that story before in my life.
Well, you heard the story. It happened.
So what does happen?
It was not,
Well,
excuse me,
he
it was
answered
not
to
the
mine.
settlers. It was not the settlers. who did it.
I'm sorry, but settlers do sometimes commit the crime. I'll admit to that settlers are capable of committing the crime of uprooting Arab olive trees. It's actually happened, but I've never heard of the IDF defying an order of the Supreme Court. I need to see your facts on that. I need the sources on that.
Because we did agree to a format.
Right.
So next one is you're up. Anything you like in your hand.
This will have to be the last one.
Hold on 1 second.
The last question.
Wait 1 second, please.
This could go on for days and days. And
Yes.
obviously, years and years. But I think it's clear, if I may say, that we have to do this again as soon as possible. And we'll cover a lot more the next time, because there has to be an end to this today. So this will be the last one, and I hope everyone agrees that this was very, very, very worthwhile, and that we should do it again as soon as we possible.
The question was, are Palestinians allowed to purchase property in Israel? Is that right?
Yes, that's the question.
And I do not have personal knowledge about the answer to that question, so I'm not going to try.
Neither do I. I can tell you what I do know, and this is just tangential to that answer. Jews can't buy property, obviously, in the West Bank, but Israeli Arabs are making a big practice of it now because the land's cheap and they have enough wealth to afford to either speculate in the land or have nice, like, vacation homes there. Again, we both don't know.
I'm unmuting so that we can close here.
Yes, we're going to close this. I want to thank all of you for being here and all of you for attending on Zoom. I think this is a great beginning, and maybe we could actually accomplish something here, because the speakers presented their point of view so well, and they represent a lot of people. And so I promise from our point of view that the first thing we're going to do is try and get another one of these going as soon as we can. And thank you both, and thank you all.